You're listening to the Sex and Psychology Podcast, the sex ed you never got in school and won't get anywhere else. I am your host, Dr. Justin Lehmiller. I am a social psychologist and research fellow at the Kinsey Institute and author of the book, Tell Me What You Want, The Science of Sexual Desire and How It Can Help You Improve Your Sex Life. Why are some people straight, whereas others are gay or bisexual? What determines our sexual orientation anyway? That's what we're going to be talking about in today's show. We're going to be diving into what we've learned about the biological origins of our sexuality from decades of scientific research. As you'll see, there's not a simple and easy story. It doesn't boil down to something like a quote-unquote gay gene. It's way more complex than that. After all, as we'll discuss in a little bit, identical twins don't always share the same sexual orientation despite having the exact same genes. So why is that? Why is it often the case that one twin is gay while the other is straight? In addition, we're going to discuss a number of curious findings in the literature, including how the number of older brothers a man has might influence his sexuality. It turns out that men who have more older brothers are more likely to be gay, so we're going to talk about what might be going on there. I am joined once again by Nathan Lentz, a professor of biology at John Jay College, where he is the director of the Cell and Molecular Biology program. His research lab studies human genetic evolution and forensic DNA technology. He also writes popular science articles and is the author of the books Not So Different, Finding Human Nature in Animals, as well as Human Errors, a panorama of our glitches, from pointless bones to broken genes. His latest book is titled The Sexual Evolution, How 500 Million Years of Sex, Gender, and Mating Shape Modern Relationships. This is going to be another fascinating episode. Stick around and we're going to jump in right after the break. Join leading researchers and experts for insightful presentations and discussions on the evolving landscape of sex and aging at the Kinsey Institute 2025 Specialty Intensive and Symposium this fall. This event will take place on October 4th, 2025, with both online and in-person attendance options available. To learn more, visit kinseyinstitute.org. And to stay up to date on the latest events and educational opportunities, follow at Kinsey Institute on the socials. Okay, Nathan, let's talk about the origins of sexual orientation. Now, as a starting point, anytime somebody asks a question like, why are some people gay? You're going to get some pushback. And it's because the question kind of implies that homosexuality is something that needs to be explained because it's not quote unquote natural in the way that heterosexuality is. And if you rephrase the question to, well, why are some people heterosexual? It sounds really absurd, right? So I understand the sensitivities around this question, but tell us why you think it's important for us to understand where sexual orientation comes from. And, how do we approach this question in a way that doesn't imply that one orientation is more quote unquote natural than another?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I think we should study these things because I'm a scientist and I want to understand everything. So the more we study, the more we know and we can know ourselves better. I agree that there's danger, of course, in these, but luckily, fortunately, the research on the genetics of orientation and just the understanding of orientation in other animals and things have run in parallel lanes to the same conclusion, which is that, again, we're not really hardwired for a strict orientation, either as a species and most of us even as individuals. But I think we are built as a species to have a variety, to have a bell curve, if you will. I don't necessarily mean that it would be that kind of normal distribution, but that there will be a spread of sexual orientations. And that's what we see in other animals as well, that most of the individuals are sort of hetero-flexible, or homo-flexible, and then you do have sort of an extreme outliers. We know this from studying bighorn sheep, among other things, where there are some bighorn sheep that will only mount other males. And there are some bighorn sheep, they're males, and there are some males that will only mount females. They just won't mount a male. But those are the outliers, so to speak. Most of them are in the middle and they'll, given the choices, they would mount either, or they like to be mounted and they won't mount anything. That kind of spread is what we see in humans as well. Probably most people are straight-ish, hetero-flexible, we'll say. Some are pretty strict on it and others are more situational. And I think that's by design. And I don't think that is necessarily purely genetic in the sense that it's reducible to this version of a gene or that version of a gene. And the reason I say that is we've looked and there isn't that, right? So the largest study that was done was by 23andMe, and where they looked at all kinds of markers and they found thousands of them all over the chromosomes. And what that tells us is that sexual orientation is genetic. It's genetic in the way that having a kidney is genetic, meaning There are genes that make you have a kidney, but you don't have a gene for the kidney, right? There's thousands of genes involved. They're spread over all the chromosomes. They're mixed and matched every generation. There's no way you can isolate this variable. And what that tells us is that our species has always benefited from having diverse sexualities and having diverse attractions or orientations, if you will. And that you're born with sort of a set of dice, and they get rolled in different ways. And sometimes it comes up your exact same genetics. You might have been born in a different time and place, in a different womb, and reared in a different environment, and you would turn out differently. I know you think that you are you, but you're not you. You are the culmination of everything that's happened to you. and part of that is genetics and part of it's environment. And I mean uterine environment, the intrauterine environment seems to play a role. And I can give examples about that. Or other way to think about it is that it's a weighted dice. So you can roll a weighted dice, and it doesn't mean you'll never get snake eyes. It just means it won't come up as commonly. And I think that we can put to rest any idea that there's a gay gene. Yeah. But what does it mean then that we have this flexible orientation? If our ancestors were right that only heterosexual sex is beneficial and everything else is aberrant, why wouldn't we all just be perfectly straight? And the answer is that perfectly straight actually is the thing that should be studied, because actually sex accomplishes a lot of different things for an individual and for the species. So think of all the times you've had sex in your life. How many of those were procreative? Very, very few. Very few times in your life where you're really even intending to result in a pregnancy. And that's true for other animals as well. They're always having sex with each other, but for a whole variety of reasons. Sometimes it's procreation. And like, for example, in animals where you can tell that they're in heat, they have estrous cycles rather than menstrual cycles. So we know, they'll have a little bit more sex during that period, but they have sex all year, all month, all year, whatever you want to say. And sometimes with members of their same sex, sometimes with the opposite sex. It's basically they have sex from any time when they have something to gain socially from it, either for themselves or for family members. And humans are the same way. You have sex for a whole variety of reasons. And in fact, animals have more reasons than we do. Well, each individual animal have its own reasons. So if you could imagine, there's 10 different things you could get out of a sexual interaction. If you were strictly heterosexual, you would be missing all of those opportunities with half of the population. You would only be interested. You would be at a disadvantage. Your aversion to sex with the same sex would actually cost you something. And so that's why I say like strict heterosexuality, that's the conundrum. And strict homosexuality as well. But you'll find that more gays have had some exploratory phase with the opposite sex just because of our default upbringing here in the society. But actually out there in nature and other animals, they're always having sex with each other and they don't have these strict aversions. The aversions are what don't make sense.
Yeah, so this question of where does sexual orientation come from is kind of inextricably tied to the question of why do we have sex, right? Because
exactly.
We need to kind of be answering both of those at the same time. But I guess the way that I like to think about it is that we all have a certain level of sexual flexibility. Again, you can think of it kind of like a dial where it can be turned way up where you're super flexible, and it can be turned way down where you're not very flexible at all. And I think that this works alongside your sexual orientation, right? So your sexual orientation is a separate dial that, orients your attraction toward male versus female or masculine versus feminine, because attraction can be about both sex and gender. But I think when you think about it through this lens of, we all have some inherent degree of flexibility, it explains why people who might identify as exclusively straight might vary in their willingness to have some type of same-sex experience, right? So you're a heterosexual guy and you're super high on this sexual flexibility. Well, if you're drunk at a party and a gay guy hits on you and offers to give you a hand job, maybe you'll accept that, right? Because you're very high on that flexibility. But if you're somebody who's low on flexibility, that's going to be a no-go for you in that situation. Now, by contrast, if you were in a situation where, let's say you're on a deserted island and there's only other men on that island, somebody who is very low on sexual flexibility suddenly might start having same-sex experiences because their options or their environment have changed in a way that even that low level of flexibility now suddenly becomes adaptive for that situation, right? So I think we all vary in how flexible we are. Everybody has some level of flexibility. It's just some people have very little of it to begin with. At least that's the way I think of it.
That's right. So there might be a genetic component to that dial that you're talking about, but there's also a social one early in childhood, for example. Up through puberty, we know that there's a lot of flexibility there. And so if you're in a society that is really negative towards same-sex sexual experiences, then of course you're going to absorb some of that. And it does end up becoming an aversion. I mean, if you're told that even thinking about it will send you to a hell that you really believe in, then of course that's going to have an impact, an imprint on the way that your sexuality develops. Now, some people are so gay and so flexible that they'll still power through that. But most of us we absorb something about what society wants to imprint us. And unfortunately, in some ways, society does have an influence on what you find attractive. And we know this is true just from looking at historical periods, right? What was attractive in a different culture and different time changes, And so if it weren't absorbed from the society, why would that be? Was it the weather? Of course not. We are social species and we learn, even in our attractions, we learn from other people. But, a lot of those attractions, aversions, and kinks, if you will, and fetishes have interesting histories to them. And, every generation doesn't come up with its own kinks, right? There are some kinks and fetishes that have been with us clearly since ancient times. Since there is historical records, we can tell that some fetishes have always been around. And that tells us something too, because here's the thing. If same-sex sexuality was so unnatural and weird and aberrant, why would there be this draconian enforcement regime for 1,000 years to try to stamp it out, right? If it were unnatural, you wouldn't need an enforcement regime. And the same thing is true with kinks and fetishes and things like this, and oral sex and all the other forms of sex that were not allowed. You wouldn't have had to punish them if they were pointless. But the fact is humans have been having same-sex sex. We've been having oral sex and anal sex and all kinds of sex with each other since we were a species and our ancestor species before that, because it did something for us. Now, what it did for us could just be, it was fun. It felt good and we did it. And it didn't hurt anything, so you just be there. That's the thing, is nature has this way of linking behaviors to our reward center, right? And so just the dopamine that you get from it is enough to be reinforcing. But in her wisdom, nature has linked sex to behaviors and social situations that are good for us, both as individuals and as a species. So a cooperative group, especially under times of stress, survival stress, having sex together builds cohesion, group cohesion. I know that, a lot of men don't want to hear that, but it's definitely true among animals and humans that those sexual bonds can release tension, lower inhibitions, build trust and bonding, and help a group work better together. So that's just one example of the social aspects of sex. And we see that in lions, for example. A lot of times people think that lion prides are led by a single male. And that's true in some parts of Africa, but actually most lion prides are led by a coalition of males. And those males have sex with each other constantly. They have more sex with each other than you do with the females. And partially it's a way of pacifying the relationship so that they don't kill each other. Instead, they work out their aggressive, because they do have aggressive tendencies. They work those out in a sexual format. So it looks like Greco-Roman wrestling, and they're, you want to try to dominate. But what's great about it is you both walk away winners. Even if you're vanquished or whatever, you're still alive. Whereas if you're a single male is the only thing that's tolerated, then they fight to the death. And even the winner will be injured in the process. So sex is just such a better way to work out dominance hierarchy than fighting. And a lot of creatures have figured that out. And of course, strengthening the pair bond. That's one, if you are a pair bonding species, and we appear to be, we are. I think that's pretty clear that we tend to form pair bonds. And sex strengthens that. It builds the trust, it builds the intimacy, and it also builds the attachment. And that, particularly in the case when there's children involved, helps promote your genetic success through your children. And none of that has to do with bringing sperm and eggs together, after the fact. So sex has a variety of purposes, and different purposes would exist in different contexts, but that flexibility is key to understanding sex, I think.
Yeah, definitely. So one of the most interesting findings in the sexual orientation literature is that we see in the research that the more genes that people share in common, the more likely they are to have the same sexual orientation. But even if you just look at studies of identical twins, If one of them is gay, there's only a 50% likelihood that the other is gay as well. And I actually know a fair number of twins who have different sexualities. And I'm talking about identical twins, and it's not just that one is in the closet and hasn't come out yet. They just have different sexualities. So why is that? How can two people who share 100% of the same DNA have different orientations? And what does this mean for our understanding of how genetics influences sexuality?
Yeah, it's not just 100% of the DNA. They also had the same uterine environment.
Yep.
They were in the same womb. They had the same childhood, mostly, at least for socioeconomic status, geography, lots of things. So they had so much in common and they still ended up different. And I love that fact because what it shows you is that biology isn't destiny. Number one, genes aren't everything. Genes and environment. And also environment doesn't just mean, like what did you eat and where did you live? It also means where was your position in the family, and what were you exposed to? And so, and a certain amount ultimately is random or sporadic or stochastic, whatever word, because different branches of science, use those words slightly differently. But I've always thought that biological systems are inherently stochastic, meaning they have this kind of uncertainty built into them, again, by design, because that way it's flexible. So by having two identical twins with identical genetics and even early childhood environments, but by having that built-in flexibility, that shows you that in certain circumstances, they might have both gone one direction or both gone in the other. The fact that they were allowed to, one becomes gay and one becomes straight, just shows that they had a good environment, if you ask me, meaning they were allowed to just kind of be who they were without a lot of crazy kind of social conditioning that went on. So kudos to their parents, I guess, for letting them be who they're going to be. But what's interesting is I really believe this. If you rewind the tape of their lives, go back to conception and remember they were a single zygote at the moment of conception, and then let it play out again, it might have worked out differently. They might have both been gay, both been straight, or flip-flop on the gay straight, because there is just this stochasticity that is built into living systems. That is what makes life different than non-life, is that kind of just inherent uncertainty, randomness, things bumping into each other and then taking shape within this selective environment. And in biology, we talk about selective environment most often in the long term of evolutionary forces. But I think it also applies in an individual's lifetime. You have a selective environment where you could be lots of different things, but the environment helps you navigate. I'm a scientist. I'm a biologist. If I had been born at a different time and place, I might very well have been an artist. I might have very well have been something else. So that selective environment sort of imprinted me. And even identical twins do not experience the world in exactly the same way. And a lot of times one is like a little bit larger than the other physically. And then they just start being treated differently. We treat children, even on their first day of life, we start to treat them differently. And that some of that does have consequences and get absorbed. So genetics isn't everything. It's something, but it's not everything.
Hey guys, have you ever wished that your finale had a few more fireworks? Then let me tell you about Load Boost from VB Health. Load Boost is a supplement designed to improve the taste, volume, and overall health of your semen. This doctor-formulated supplement isn't just about performance, it's all about results. Founded in Denver, VB Health takes quality seriously. Made in the USA, NSF certified, and produced in an FDA-registered facility, this isn't the garbage they're selling in your local gas station. They even share their third-party lab results publicly because, unlike some of your exes, they've got nothing to hide. Thousands of guys across all 50 states and 45 countries have already tried Load Boost, and over 88% of the reviews are 4 or 5 stars from verified buyers. It's time to elevate your performance, and thanks to Load Boost, you just might become someone's new favorite performer. Learn more and get yours at loadboost.com. Visit loadboost.com and use code Justin for 10% off, or click the link in the show notes. So what I've heard increasingly as people talk about this topic is that, well, maybe sexual orientation, instead of being genetic, is epigenetic. And so maybe it's about how our genes interact with the environment, and that there are certain environmental factors that are effectively turning on or off different genes or different sets of genes. And so maybe that's what accounts for why two people might have different sexual orientations despite having the same DNA. It's that maybe their environment was different in some way. Like maybe there was some different hormonal exposure in the uterine environment for two identical twins, or maybe some other difference in environmental or other exposure that just in some way affects the genes that control or operate sexual orientation.
Right. Epigenetics would be the mechanism of what I was talking about, how you have genes kind of in this generic sort of way, but it doesn't determine you because there's a lot of forks in the road for gene expression too. And sometimes you start down that road a little bit and then it becomes self-reinforcing. And epigenetics would be the mechanism. So it's ultimately still about molecules in our brain. We're back to that. It's about molecules in the brain, but there is such a thing as predisposition, right? So it's probabilistic. And this is the nature of biology that frustrates people the most, is that it's almost always probabilistic, right? It is not deterministic. So you can be born with a certain probability of this, but where you actually end up is, I don't want to say random as much as unpredictable. Because when I throw a set of dice, it's random, but it is still physics, like at work, right? We could literally get down to the movement of individual molecules, but we could never predict it, right? So that's that chaos of living systems, that uncertainty. And here's the punchline of all of this, is it explains that diversity is normal. It's natural. It's expected, actually, that we would have a diverse population, given all of this stochasticity. So if we can just put aside the judgments of right and wrong or superiority, inferiority, and just let everyone be, what we'll find is that diversity is one of our greatest strengths. Really, we're probably the most diverse species in a lot of different ways. And what that says about us is that diversity has benefited us, because where you see diversity means that there wasn't what we call the opposite of balancing. So balancing selection is when you promote diversity. And that seems to be what we've had. But a lot of times you have is either stabilizing selection that kind of removes outliers and wants everybody to be the same. We just don't show the signs of that. As a species, we have vastly different heights, weights, strengths, skin tones, eye color, hair. We are so diverse as a species. And again, that shows that it's always been good for us to have diversity. It's been a benefit for us to be adaptability. So I think if we apply that same lesson to sex and gender, we'd be a lot better off.
Yeah. So there are a ton of different findings in the literature on sexual orientation, finding that homosexuality is related to a bunch of biomarkers. So, for example, the fraternal birth order effect is one of them, which is this idea that the more older brothers a man has, the more likely he is to be gay. And we're only talking about biologically related brothers, not adopted brothers. There's also a lot of research on the 2D, 4D digit ratio. So the ratio of your pointer finger to your ring finger, and the relative length of those two is pretty consistently related to sexual orientation. And then, we've got all of these other findings that are out there that just, I think to a lot of people strike them as seemingly random. Like, well, why does the number of older brothers matter? Or how would that play a role? Or why do these finger length ratios matter so much? So I guess my question for you about this is, what do those findings, these biomarkers that are related to sexual orientation, what do they tell us? What are the conclusions that we can draw from something like, say, the number of older brothers a man has and how that's related to his sexuality?
Well, let's take these two examples, 2D to 4D ratio. One thing we do know about that is the mechanism. It's exposure to androgens, to testosterone and its close relatives. So the ratio of your second digit, your pointer finger, and your fourth digit, your ring finger, the height difference between those, or the length, is related to how much testosterone you had, because testosterone proceeds in a gradient, right? And so the pointer finger might be exposed to a higher percentage than the fourth finger, and so on. What's interesting is you see that in other animals too, and you can actually predict pretty well fetal exposure to androgen based on your 2D 4D ratio. Mm-hmm. And that was first discovered in humans as being associated with lesbianism. So women who prefer other women as their sexual partners, that shows up in their 2D 4D ratio. We actually see it in men as well, and you see it differences between men and women. You see it cross culture. It indicates all interesting things. But why that would be, we have no idea. Why that would be, we have no idea. But we do think we understand the mechanism. The opposite example of that is what you mentioned, the fraternal birth order effect. So in a given uterus, the more males that uterus has, each one has a slightly higher chance of becoming homosexual as an adult. So in other words, when you were born, if you have older brothers, you're more likely to be gay. And in fact, the more older brothers you have, the more likely you are. It's a weak effect, but it's very consistent. It's consistent across cultures and time periods. And you've done these studies in all corners of the world. Now, that one, we don't know the mechanism. There have been a couple of candidate genes and proteins that were studied. Most of them didn't follow up. So that would be what we call the proximate mechanism, the molecular mechanism. But we do have some ideas about the ultimate mechanism, about why that might be. Because we see this by studying other animals. There's sometimes when there's plenty of individuals, so population growth isn't really a value, then it's often a time for what we call quality. So sometimes some individuals and situations are designed to just produce more offspring. And then other times you subject those offspring to selection environment so that you improve the gene pool, right? And so a lot of times if a uterus has a lot of sons, that's an indication that the population is fine, that there's plenty of individuals, they're surviving long enough to have multiple children. So we actually don't really need more people. What we need potentially is quality of life, so to speak. So improvement of the gene pool, whatever you want to say. And this is where the tendency to have homosexuals instead of heterosexuals might prove a benefit, because homosexuals might not be as competitive in their reproductive game. They're still going to contribute to the society. They're still going to promote, the success of their kin, especially. And that was the theory that most people have settled on, is that the gay uncles that are spoiling their nieces and nephews, they don't need to have their own kids.
The rich gay uncle hypothesis. Yes.
Yeah, exactly. And the fact that it plays out in human society that way is, it might be our own bias, just seeing it that way, especially because we don't seem to see the fraternal birth order effect in other animals just because they don't apply the labels of sexuality like we do. So ultimately, we don't know the answer. But what I love about these results is that it shows that there is biology. Biology isn't unimportant here. Biology isn't everything, but it's definitely something. So the fact that 50% of monozygotic twins have the same orientation, if you begin with one of them being gay, that tells you that biology is important, but it's just not everything. And the interaction between biology and environment seems to be where all the action is, which again promotes the idea that an adaptable, flexible, diverse society is the one that's best prepared for a future that you can't predict.
With all of these findings, like fraternal birth order effect and finger length ratios, nothing works 100% of the time, right? A lot of these are relatively small effects. And, a lot of people will hear the data and say, well, I'm gay, but I didn't have any older brothers, so therefore your theory is invalid. And it's like, no, that's not the right way to interpret it. These are small effects. And I think the caveat is that maybe they're each telling us something different about the origin of sexual orientation, and that maybe there are different pathways to a given orientation, right? So for example, if you think about something like the finger length ratios, right? The typical male pattern is that the pointer finger is shorter than the ring finger, right? And that's a biomarker for your testosterone exposure in utero. And in a lot of the early research where they looked at this in the context of gay men, they were finding that they tended to show the more feminine pattern, which was that their finger length ratios were equal. So the hypothesis at the time was that, well, maybe gay men in utero were exposed to less testosterone, right? But, it doesn't make sense to say that gay men as a group, that they've all had less testosterone exposure, right? So if you look at my finger length ratio and the ratios of lots of other gay men, they actually show an exaggerated male pattern, right? And this is what we see in a lot of the research too, is that for many gay men, they're not showing the feminine pattern, they're showing this exaggerated version, which suggests that they got even more testosterone exposure in the womb. And so the way I like to think of it is that, when we think about gay as a category, that's not just one thing. There are different types or categories of gay people, right? And one might be more masculine, one might be more feminine, one might be more androgynous or in the middle. And maybe it's all related to something like testosterone exposure in utero. And that maybe that's why these findings don't apply in 100% of the cases, because there isn't just one pathway to being gay.
I think that's exactly right. It's multifactorial. And in certain instances, one factor might be more important than others. And then in a different environment, another factor would dominate. And that's the thing about testosterone. They used to try to give it to homosexuals to make them heterosexual. And boy, did that not work. It made them more homosexual. All it did is boost their libido, their gay libido. So we know that you can't just switch it on with hormone exposures. Now, whether you could in utero or not is an open question. But generally what you find is that uterine exposure can masculinize your body. There's not a lot of evidence that it masculinizes your brain so much, uterine exposure. So again, to me, the same answer comes back every time. Multifactorial is what influences, creates adaptability, flexibility, a little bit of randomness, a little bit of variety. Variety is the spice of life. That's been an axiom for a long time. And biology gets that, I think, inherently. The fraternal birth order effect was first discovered by a psychiatrist in London who was a horrible person. He was a eugenicist and racist and everything. And he was trying to, of course, cure. But the way he found it was kind of roundabout, because the first thing he found was that homosexuals in London had older mothers. That's what he found first. And then when he looked deeper, he found the reason why is because they have older siblings and blah, blah, blah. But think about that. Having an older mother being more likely to produce homosexuals also makes sense, right? An older mother who's approaching menopause. And that's a switch that goes from producing more offspring to caring for the offspring. When you get older in life, producing more offspring, they're just going to compete with each other. But if you invest in the children that you already have, or their children, the whole grandmother hypothesis with menopause, homosexuals can fit into that too. If we assume that that is a fairly strict orientation, which I'm not sure it is, but if you did, then it would fit in that model too. Now, this is a lot of just so stories, kind of, building a narrative around this. But this is where we get our ideas. And this is where we try to find hypotheses that we can probe. And in the study of sexuality, the lesson that just keeps coming back is that flexibility. The reason why ancient Greece looked different sexually is that they weren't different genetically, right? They just had a different environment in which those genes found expression.
Yeah. And this is why, as you talk about in your book, it's not the case that homosexuality or any orientation other than heterosexuality will be eventually bred out of the population, right? So there is something inherent to our genetic makeup that we just continue to produce sexual diversity. And just because we live in a world today where gay people have more freedom to enter same-sex relationships and marriages and no longer feel compelled, at least in many parts of the world, to enter a heterosexual seeming marriage, right? Because they were trying to fulfill some social expectations or there were taboos on homosexuality. Just because gay people have more freedom to live their lives, it doesn't mean that we're going to see a reduction in rates of homosexuality in the future population, right?
No, not at all. And in fact, probably the opposite, because with the removal of a lot of the taboos and negative aversions and things, what you'll find is a more flexible approach to sexuality in general. And that's what you're seeing among Gen Z. The youngest generation now who are in post-pubertal age, almost everybody is a little bit gay, right? They tend to be much more flexible with their approach to it. And it's just not frowned upon, at least by your peers, as much. But it's not like everybody's becoming gay, right? You're just having people just kind of be themselves in a more open way without that judgmentalism. So I don't think that rates of homosexuality, if you could measure that, I don't think it will ever be much of a factor other than by social influences. I think that the genetics of it are so diffuse among all the chromosomes that it would be impossible to breed out anyway, even if you could apply a very strong negative selection, which of course there was a period of time when you sort of did. But I think that the new social life that's taking hold around the world, and it's penetrating deep into the world. There are some areas that have what I would consider a ways to go, but it's still getting through, right? The globalization is just a force that is marching without our consent anyway. So what that's going to mean is that we're going to be in a bold new sexual future where everyone does what they want. Is that so scary? Yeah, is that so scary?
Well, to some people it is.
And it is. And that's the thing is social fabric and predictability means a lot to some people. And in fact, it means a lot to all of us. It's just how we apply it. What is scary? What is okay? And at least, though, I hope that the science has a seat at the table. That's really why I wrote the book, to be honest. Is not that I want this to turn out one way or the other, as much as I think that it should be informed by the best science.
And I can certainly appreciate that. Well, thank you so much for this amazing conversation, Nathan. It was a pleasure to have you here. Can you please tell my listeners where they can go to learn more about you and your work and get a copy of your new book?
Well, if you Google Nathan Lentz, I think I'm the only one out there that's doing this kind of stuff. So I am on social media. I'm just not very active. I don't like social media, to be honest. But I'm on Instagram and Twitter and Blue Sky. Just nominally, I'm there, Nathan Lentz or Nathan Lentz 15. But if you Google me and you go to the Human Evolution blog, that's really the best way, because I send a newsletter out about once a month. So sign up for the Human Evolution blog, and then you'll see what I'm up to. And pretty much everything I write ends up on that blog eventually.
Great. And I'll be sure to include links to all of that in the show notes. Thank you again so much for your time. I really appreciate having you here.
All right. Thank you. It was a pleasure.
Thank you for listening. To keep up with new episodes of this podcast, visit my website, Sex and Psychology, at sexandpsychology.com, or subscribe on your favorite platform, where I hope you'll take a moment to rate and review the show. If you listen on Apple Podcasts, please consider becoming a Sex and Psychology Premium subscriber to enjoy ad-free listening for just $3.99 a month. You can also follow me on social media for daily sex research updates. I'm on Blue Sky and X at Justin Lehmiller and Instagram at Justin J. Lehmiller. Also, be sure to check out my book, Tell Me What You Want. Thanks again for listening. Until next time.